understand what is CBAM. Now, CBAM, when we look at it, it's another, we might think it's another acronym from the ESG alphabet soup, right? But CBAM essentially stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And it's essentially designed by the EU as a carbon pricing mechanism. And the idea behind it is to establish a fair price for any sort of carbon that is emitted during the production of goods which are carbon intensive, right, beyond the EU borders. So any goods which have a lot of embedded carbon in them, a lot of embedded emissions in them, if they are entering an EU border, there has to be a fair price paid for the carbon emitted, which carbon emitted beyond the EU borders, right? We'll get into the details of this definition very soon. So how it works out is, let's say you are someone who produces certain goods, right? And all of these goods are essentially getting into the European Union. So that is who you are. You are a installation in a non-EU country. Now you are sending out this good through an importer. So this importer then once they take up the goods, they basically go and tell the customs that, hey, I have imported XYZ goods from a non-EU country, and these are in potentially CBAM goods, right? So once the EU border importer, the customs authority has essentially been flagged that there are these are CBAM goods, the customs then shares this import information with the saying that we will need the CBAM reporting for this, right? And when the import information which the customs at that point looks for is, think of things like CN codes. CN codes are nothing but definitions or codes which help you identify what the good is, right? How much of that good sort of you have purchased? Is it 1 ton? Is it 100 tons? Whatever the good is, how much of you have purchased? Also the country of origin, where is it coming from? India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the date of release, right? And the date of release for free circulation. So these are some of the basic data points that they ask for. Now, after this, once these data points are asked for, to prepare the quarterly, so there's a quarterly CBAM report which has to be prepared, right? So to prepare this quarterly CBAM report, the importer then requests for the embedded emissions data, which is from the installations, which is us in this case, the countries who are essentially non-EU countries who are sending out goods to the European Union, right? So they reach out to us and they ask us for the embedded emissions data in this case. Now, how does the supplier provide the embedded emissions data? Now, either you can measure the data if it is available with you. And in case you're not able to measure the data, then there are some default values which the CBAM authority, right, the European Commission sort of provides. And you can use this measured data or this default values in case you do not have measured data. Now, there is an option for third-party verification, which is during the transitional period. But the transitional period ends sometime in 2026 Jan. So right now we are in the transitional period, and at this point of time, the verification is optional, but going forward, it will become mandatory, right? Now, once this data is received, now every quarter, then the responsibility lies with the importer. The importer then will submit a CBAM report to the CBAM transitional registry, right? Now here again, the report basically lists down things like imported, the amount, the thing which you have imported, the quantity of it, the direct emissions from that, or wherever possible, wherever required, rather if there's any indirect emissions, and if any carbon price has been paid abroad. Now this report is sent by the importer to the European Commission. Now once this information, sort of the European Commission then exchanges this particular information with a member state. The member state is essentially any EU nation, their competent authority. So there are member state competent authorities who have been designated to handle these CBAM cases. Now, this information is sent to the member state's competent authority, and if the reporter are missing, late, or straightforward, inaccurate in some cases, this authority might initiate checks wherever it is applicable, and if there are any possibility or potential for penalties, they will apply that. Now, this is the sort of the flow during the transitional phase, right? So you understand who all the players are in this setup. You have the non-EU country installations, then you have the importer who's basically taking it from you, then you have the customs with whom the initial data is shared, and then you have the European Commission and the competent authorities who actually look at the CBAM data, the CBAM report, the quarterly report and the annual report, and check if there is any verification or any penalties which are applicable, right? Now, moving on now, why did we sort of introduce CBAM? Now, there are quite a few reasons for introduction of CBAM. One of the key reasons was basically to prevent any sort of carbon leakage. Now, what the European Union, because the European Union has a net zero goal of 2050, right? They were essentially pushing a lot of the carbon intensive production processes to the global south, which means that the emission was anyway happening, but it was just not under the purview of the European Union. So to avoid that, they sort of implemented, and to complement the and reinforce the EU emissions trading scheme, right? They sort of implemented CBAM. Now this ensures fair competition. Why fair competition? Because earlier what would happen is, because the European Union, if there's any production out there and they were part of the emissions trading scheme, they would have to pay an extra tax, right? Which means that countries like ours, which were not part of the emissions trading scheme, never paid that tax, and that's why we had a price advantage. So this sort of ensured introducing CBAM ensures that we also pay the carbon tax. Therefore, it ensures fair competition. Thirdly, it sort of encourages any sort of global decarbonization, right? Now, or like initially when I was making the statement that emission heavy production was always pushed to the global south, the emissions were anyway happening, right? It was just not happening within EU borders. So to prevent that and promote a sort of a decarbonized supply chain, the CBAM was sort of introduced. And this again, like I said, 2050 EU net zero goals, it aligns with them. And also because you have this extra penalty or the carbon tax which is being coming out, that means it is generating revenue for climate action. This means that revenue once generated can actually be pushed into decarbonizing or funding climate tech, funding prevention of climate change, or rather mitigation of climate change. So this was the whole sort of idea behind introduction of CBAM, right? Now, what are the key features, what we learned from the last 2-3 slides? What are the key features of CBAM? Firstly, it is nothing but a tax or a tariff or a duty which is levied on the imported goods. Now, which goods? Currently, there are 6 sectors where CBAM is applicable to. We are expecting the number of sectors to go up in the future. These 6 sectors are essentially carbon intensive sectors. So they are iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, cement, hydrogen, and electricity, right? Which of these goods is it applicable to, as in where should they be sourced from? If they are sourced from a non-EU country, that is someone who is not linked to the European Union's emissions trading scheme, it is applicable to all of those countries. Now, is it applicable for goods of all values? No. Any consignment whose value is above 150 euro, which is pretty much, I'm guessing, 95% of the consignments, right? It is applicable to all of them. And when is it applicable from? So technically, right now, we are in the transitional phase. The transitional phase lasted from 2020. It started back in 2023, and we are still in the transitional phase. But starting from 2026, we will move into the mandatory phase, right? So Jan 2026. That means we have to submit our emissions data as well as information on if we have paid any carbon price on top of it or not.